Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to speak with you today about alcohol and stress interactions, and most importantly, its effects over time on our brain, our body, and behaviors. Let me go ahead and share my screen and turn on my slides so you can follow along with the content of this lecture. I want to also thank the Research Society on Alcoholism for putting together these lecture series. So what comes to mind when you think about the word alcohol? You might think about getting some relaxation after a hard day's work. You might think about socializing and partying. You might think about fun, as you see in these images. You might think about pleasure or reward. But it also brings to mind anxiety, some pain, drinking in relation to pain, in relation to stress, having a hard feeling burden, having a hard day at work and wanting to go share drinks. Under those conditions, feeling depressed, being lonely are all reasons that can provoke drinking. And in fact, with increased levels of drinking, you might have a greater desire for drinking, craving alcohol, and getting us away from our day-to-day work and motivating us to stay engaged in other activities. And so what happens when we consume alcohol? Well, we do know that it does stimulate these dopamine-rich regions, which is the reward regions. And that's what's shown here in this image. This is a slice inside the brain. And you see the forehead right here. This region in red here is called the prefrontal cortex. And it's just showing, it's a cartoon just showing that this is a pathway that is rich in dopamine neurochemical, and that has been associated with reward and pleasure. However, this chemical and this pathway is very integral to learning and motivation. And in fact, when we are in the throes of stress, high levels of stress, there's a real need to learn and adapt and to figure out what is the best way to cope with the situation to reduce our stress and to not get ourselves back in that situation again. So there is this bidirectional relationship between stress and drinking. And what is that link? My lab became very focused on trying to understand that specific connection so that we can target that to help individuals manage that particular association. So one of the things that's really important with alcohol effects is how much do we take in? Alcohol is a very powerful pharmacological agent, and so the more you drink and how you drink it might have a bigger effect. You might think of it in those terms. The more we drink, the more its impact. And so in a 2-hour period, if you have one drink and you're a woman, that's low levels, low risk drinking. If you have 2 drinks and you're a man, that's low risk drinking. When you start to ramp up, moderate levels become 3 to 4 or 2 to 3 in women. And then binge levels are 5+ drinks in men, 5 or more, and in women 4 or more. And the National Institute of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse has come up with these standards based on a lot of evidence and data. And what you can see is non-hazardous levels are low levels, like 7 or less in a week. In men, 14 or less in a week. Whereas hazardous levels of drinking are above 8 drinks in a week for women and above 15 for men. So that's one way of thinking about what is the index of how much, and then how fast is another really important aspect, which is in a 2-hour period, or how quickly, how many shots or how many beers do you end up consuming. Here's a cartoon of data showing alcohol's effects on our cardiovascular system or on our heart rate and heart rate variability during sleep. Now, we might think you went out and you partied, you had moderate or high levels of drinking, you came back and you went to sleep. Even in those acute drinking bouts, there is an impact on sleep. And that's what I'm showing you here. This is heart rate on the y-axis, and the open symbols are showing when you don't have alcohol on board, where heart rates are. And this is in a large group of numbers of people, in over 4,000 individuals in Finland who wore this passive biomonitoring device on their chest. It's called Bodyguard from First Speed Technologies. And you can see that during the first, second, and third hour of sleep, those who had high levels of drinking, so definitely above 5 or more drinks, their heart rates went up and it did not recover as much in the 3 hours. Similarly, heart rate variability, or the reverse of sympathetic arousal or arousing systems of our cardiovascular pathway, the system that actually puts brakes on the heart rate is called the heart rate variability parasympathetic pathway, and heart rate variability is one of those measures. And what you see here is that, in fact, heart rate variability is depressed. So the ability for the cardiovascular system to regulate itself and control the heart rate going up starts to get blunted, even after an acute bout of alcohol at high levels of alcohol. If we start to think then over time, what happens in an individual who may have alcohol use disorder, what we have reported is that baseline levels of heart rate are much higher in individuals with alcohol use disorder, marked here as AD, compared to those who are light social drinkers. More importantly, if you're then stressed, and this is an experiment we did where people were stressed on one day, we provoked their stress pathway with an emotional stress task, or we made them relax with a neutral stimuli, or we exposed them to alcohol cues. What we show here is that individuals with alcohol use disorder show a blunted response to stress. So in fact, when appropriately your heart rate needs to go up under stress conditions, for social drinkers that happens, and for individuals with alcohol use disorder, it doesn't. So there are some, over time, with high levels of drinking, there are adaptations in the cardiovascular system. Similarly, there are adaptations in our stress hormonal system. So in addition to stimulating reward, what I'm showing you here is that alcohol is stimulating our cardiovascular system, our stress arousal systems, as well as our stress hormone systems. And here is cortisol levels from the plasma that I'm showing you. And light gray bars are light moderate drinkers. And in dark bars are the binge drinkers, they're binge social drinkers. And what you see is an adaptation going on where there is a higher level in 2 separate studies. I'm showing you the same type of data in 2 separate studies. Binge drinkers tend to have higher cortisol levels at basal state compared to light moderate drinkers. And in fact, cortisol gets stimulated by alcohol, as I said earlier. And even with 1 or 2 to 3 beers here, what you see, the more people drink, the greater the alcohol-related cortisol stimulation, and there's more stimulation in binge heavy drinkers because they've consumed more. However, if you then expose them to stress, like I showed you earlier in the earlier experiment, or alcohol cues or the control neutral condition, under stress conditions, our binge heavy drinkers do not mobilize their cortisol response. So they have a blunted cortisol response to stress. When in fact, under acute stress conditions, we really do need to stimulate our cortisol response so that it can signal to the rest of the brain and the body to mobilize for action, whether it is to save ourselves if you're in a dangerous situation, to run perhaps, or to manage to figure out what to do to get ourselves out of the pickle that we may be in. And so what you see here is an adaptation or a change that has occurred under acute stress conditions for those who are binge drinkers. And then more importantly, we had people do the alcohol taste test, or basically taste alcohol and look at their quantity of drinking in this experiment. And what we find is that the more blunted your cortisol response, the greater amount of alcohol you consume. And so there is a connection between cortisol, the stress hormone, which is involved in motivation, as well as how much alcohol we consume. And so we now want to turn our attention to alcohol's effects on that reward pathway that I mentioned. What you're seeing here in the red blobs is the reward pathway. These are brain slices. The nose is over here and right here. And right there, deep inside the brain, are the reward pathways. This is one part of it, the ventral part of it, and this is the dorsal part of it. And what you see here is what I've already told you, that alcohol, an acute dose of alcohol, will stimulate the reward pathway right there. And this is a pretty good dose of alcohol, about equivalent to 4 to 5 drinks. And so it stimulates this dopamine-rich reward motivation pathway. However, the key thing in the lower set of graphs is that heavy drinkers, and when it's blue, it means they're lower or blunted. Heavy drinkers have a lower response compared to light drinkers. So even in the dopamine-rich reward pathways, we start to see adaptation and blunting with increased levels of alcohol. What about our emotion regions? Amygdala is an emotion region in the brain. It's a very critical region to signal the rest of the pathways when we are starting to face stress or fear or a high emotional signal. And right there is the amygdala. And when it's red, yellow, it means it's getting stimulated. And so when they're exposed to some threatening faces, you have an amygdala response. And what I'm showing you here is that under alcohol conditions, that response is blunted. So alcohol does blunt and dampen this emotion-rich region. And the important thing here that I'd like to point out is that what we may think that stress actually gets dampened by alcohol, this is really an example of that a higher dose of alcohol, equivalent to about 4 to 5 drinks, will get you to have a blunted amygdala response. Now, that is not very good if, in fact, it's dark outside and you want to be paying attention and being vigilant in case there may be some threatening stimuli that may come up, something scary that may show up. And so you don't want your amygdala to be blunted. You want your amygdala to be firing up and then signaling to the rest of the brain and body to tell us what to do. And so under these conditions, what we also see is that individuals who are heavy drinkers show this blunted responding under alcohol conditions. Now, one of the things I'd like to talk about is this frontal region of the brain. This frontal region of the brain is really important for stress because when you are stressed, we really need to mobilize our frontal regions because it's involved in coping. And I'm going to show you how it's involved in coping in a minute. But when you see red, yellow, it means that over time, when stress is coming at us, there is a high level of mobilization of the prefrontal cortex. And the greater the mobilization, the more the activation, the better the active levels of coping that an individual reports, that they are much bigger active copers. However, they're in vulnerable individuals, regular community individuals, what we found is that they don't show this mobilization of our prefrontal cortex. And when that happens, those are individuals that tend to report greater levels of emotional eating. So there's much more blunted responding here in the lower levels, and there's greater eating right there, greater emotional eating, more difficulties in regulating our emotions and in managing stress, and also higher levels of drinking, 6+ drinks per occasion, 4 to 5 drinks per occasion, when in fact there's a lower mobilization of the prefrontal cortex. So once again, blunted responding of the prefrontal cortex, of the dopamine signals, as well as the amygdala signals that may in fact lead to more vulnerable adaptive behaviors. And right here again is a slice of our brain. The nose is over here, the forehead is right there, and you see a mark here showing that this prefrontal region of the brain is a hot spot because it's involved in resilient coping and in regulating our stress, our craving, and alcohol use behaviors. What happens then in alcohol use disorder in individuals who have been drinking heavily for a significant period of time, and as they begin to think, oh, I've got to cut back, and they initiate treatment? What are the challenges that occur when people are faced with initiating recovery? Now, definitely treatment works and recovery is possible. Many people initiate recovery and continue on the path to recovery. However, there's also the vulnerability to relapse, and stimuli like stressors can jeopardize our recovery. I want to read to you someone who had reached out to me to report what happened, how they felt their brain and their minds change during the early recovery period. At 8 weeks without a drop, I really notice I'm living less on instinct and habit. I can think much more clearly and take time to process thoughts maturely before acting. I even notice I'm just talking less. I haven't had fully formed thoughts for so very long. It's kind of nice to have my faculties back again. In the past, it's all been so superficial, just to get me from A to B, just to keep up the veneer of being a full human. But underneath, I was just a slave to the bottle, hungover, fighting myself, very much a knee-jerk reaction. But now I'm no longer filling silences, nagging at my kids, interrupting people when they're talking. I'm just listening and not even planning how to react. Just sitting with the moments and observing, hearing, feeling quiet and content in myself. I even think I found my chi. Without even knowing what that word meant a week ago, I felt something like a place inside my soul. Something I think I remember discovering as a child and teen before alcohol smothered it, a presence of myself. Now, this person had initiated recovery and really in a very beautifully articulated way has captured what our experiments and our data and figures cannot, graphs cannot really show that. This is really her experience of what that early recovery period is about. Well, as we think about the brain, again, when you see blue blobs, that means the brain is showing lower functional response. And when you see red, yellow blobs, it means it's showing higher functional response. And what you're seeing here is in the stress relative to the control condition, the neutral condition in individuals with alcohol use disorder, they're entering treatment, they're initiating recovery. They show a blunted response in this prefrontal region, in this hotspot region that we need for regulating our stress and our cravings. Well, it doesn't work very well in that early phase and also under alcohol challenge situations. And instead, under relaxed situation, there's a hyperexcitability, there's a hyperactivity in that frontal region in the brain. And we call this a disrupted prefrontal system that then is unable to help us regulate our emotions, our stressors, and even in challenge situations when we are faced with decisions about drinking and alcohol. And what we show then is that with greater the number of days of abstinence, so each day counts. We say this in AA, and in fact, that is true with the data as well. Each day counts. Individuals who had fewer days of abstinence, they had a more blunted response in this prefrontal region. And they were more prone to relapse, more prone to returning to heavy drinking during that early phase of treatment. On the other hand, individuals who had longer periods of abstinence, they were less likely to engage in heavy drinking during those early first weeks of treatment. And so what these data are telling us is that each day of abstinence or reduced levels of drinking matters. Each day that we go down to low risk or no drinking helps our brain start to recover and slowly get back to normalcy, but that it takes time. And so what I want to end with is showing you a cartoon. The cartoon is coming. What I want to end with first is to just list what are our markers of alcohol relapse risk. Well, if you're feeling high levels of stress and anxiety and cognitive changes, sort of blurry, not being able to focus, those are risk factors for relapse. High levels of craving, high basal pulse and heart rate variability, high basal cortisol levels, and then blunted responding in these measures, both in cortisol and in our pulse rate. Blunted responding to stress in the brain as well, in the prefrontal cortex. Hyperresponsivity at the basal state are all markers of high relapse risk. So now I want to show you a cartoon of what happens with progressively increases levels of drinking. You might face stress and trauma, and that may make us more increased vulnerability to drinking. But with higher levels of drinking, our brain changes in the stress and reward pathways. Some of this data I have just shown you. We might start to get tolerant to the drug. We might start to have some withdrawal symptoms, and we might also show some sensitization, which is basically an increased wanting for the drug. But under stress and alcohol conditions then, we will show some emotion dysregulation, meaning we are unable to regulate our emotions and figure out how best to cope with the situation at hand. So there's lower levels of coping, there's higher craving, higher distress symptoms, and that leads to greater levels of stress and vulnerability to trauma and increased levels of drug use. So this is our cartoon of progressively what higher levels of drinking can begin to do to our brain stress and emotion pathways and our reward and motivation pathways. Treatment is absolutely beneficial and important to seek out. and get yourselves onto the path to recovery or reducing the levels of drinking from high risk to low risk levels of drinking, but it takes time. And so I want to end with that point and with this slide and acknowledge all of the members at the Yale Stress Center who have been doing all of this work, because without that, we would not have had this knowledge. Thank you so much for your attention.